The Guardian of the Nijmegen Bridge, the Walter J. McGoldrick story. The Gift and the Family Line, May 1942. The spring of 1942 didn't just bring the blooming of New Brunswick's wildflowers. It brought a quiet, heavy transformation for young Walter J. McGoldrick. As he traded the familiar skyline of St. John for the sharp, rhythmic cadence of the Fredericton marching squares, he wasn't just a recruit in 13 Platoon C Company. He was a son carrying the weight of a family's hope. On the eve of his departure, his mother offered a gift that would become his most sacred possession, a small leather-bound diary. With a trembling but certain hand, she inscribed the inside cover, "To Walter with love from Mum on his 24th birthday." It was more than a notebook. It was a tether to the life he was leaving behind, a vessel for the history he was destined to write, and a silent promise that he had a home to return to. Walter's first entries were a map of his heart, anchored by the ink of his own hand. He didn't write of grand strategy, but of the people who were his North Star. At the very top of his notes, he recorded his identity and purpose. A 25,791, rifle no, the cold alphanumeric string that now defined his place in the machine of war. But beneath that military veneer lay the man, and a vulnerability he only shared with these pages. The most poignant entry, a line that aches with the finality of a departing soldier, marks the exact second his world changed. Saw last, the 22nd of September, 1942, Tuesday night, 10 o'clock. In that quiet Tuesday night air, 10 o'clock wasn't just a time. It was the moment the door closed on his civilian life. His beloved dot at 149 Winslow Street became a memory he would have to fight to return to. He carefully listed his other anchors. His brother-in-law, Gordon Doe Maybe, soaring with the RCAF. His sister Kathleen, and his grandmother, Emma West, waiting at 123 Fairfax Road in London, a home away from home across a dark, dangerous Ocean Point 1. For the McGoldricks, the uniform was a second skin. Walter's father, William, was already a seasoned CQMS working at the No. 7 District Depot in Fredericton at the experimental farm. Even his uncle, Ed McGoldrick, who had brought the family name from Massachusetts to the rugged shores of New Brunswick, stood as a pillar of service. The transition from land to sea was swift and staggering. Walter's hand recorded the shift with a mix of awe and resolve. Boarded ship at Halifax Wed, Sept. 23. Sailed Tuesday 29th, 9 o'clock in morn. Largest convoy so far. He looked out over the rail and saw a steel armada. He wasn't just on a boat. He was one of over 60,000 soldiers crossing the Atlantic. He took careful note of his temporary home, the SS Pasteur, a French vessel, only 3 years old, and a massive 30,000 tons. As the SS Pasteur cut through the gray, churning swells, Walter's inner world began to mirror the turbulent sea. The salt spray of the North Atlantic wasn't just cold, it was a relentless reminder of the miles growing between him and the warmth of Winslow Street. His diary became his only confidant as he battled a profound, hollow seasickness and an even deeper loneliness. By September 30th, the world turned dull and the ocean rough. He admitted to feeling, quote, kind of sick the first crack in his soldier's exterior. As the calendar turned to October, the isolation set in. He described the sea as awful, but it was the word lonesome that carried the most weight, a quiet confession of a young man missing the steady anchor of his family. Yet, even through the haze of nausea and the cold rain, the spirit of the young man from St. John remained awake to the world. Between entries about firing tests and the looming violence of war, Walter recorded moments of pure, childlike wonder. He stared into the vast Atlantic and saw whales breaching the surface, porpoises dancing in the ship's wake, and the ethereal glow of electric fish illuminating the dark water at night. To a young man who had never witnessed the mysteries of the deep, these sights were a startling contrast to the 30,000 tons of steel beneath his feet. By October 6th, the gray monotony of the open ocean finally broke. As the convoy maneuvered into the Irish Sea, the sickness and the quote, gave way to a breathtaking sight. Walter leaned over the rail, his eyes finally meeting the emerald horizon of a new world. He didn't just see land, he saw a sanctuary. He marveled at the very beautiful country, noting how the islands and the shore rose up to meet them like a dream. After days of nothing but heaving gray water and loneliness, the sight of solid, green earth felt like a benediction, a reminder of the beauty he was sworn to protect. Even in his darkest moments of fatigue, he remained disciplined, recording every day. This wasn't just a log of a voyage. It was the record of a man enduring the English waiting room of the Atlantic. With his father in Fredericton, his uncle in St. John, and the memory of Dot's smile at 10 p.m. tucked into the pages of his mother's gift, Walter began a journey of quiet courage, one that would lead him from the mud of Camp Borden to the iron shadows of the Nijmegen Bridge. 2. Lifelines and Lessons, November 1942 to March 1944. The damp chill of the English barracks was broken on November 19, 1942, by a care package from Dorothy. For Walter, opening that box was a sensory reunion with St. John. He meticulously recorded every treasure in his diary: 24 bars of tobacco, 10 packages of rolling papers, 60 bags of tea, a box of chocolates, and a package of cookies. There were even 2 books to carry his mind far from the muddy trenches. These weren't just supplies. They were a physical manifestation of Dot's love, keeping the man alive while the soldier learned his grim trade. His days were soon consumed by the heavy vibration of a Norton motorcycle. At Gatton Manor, a grand estate turned proving ground, Walter and his friend Bert Rowell trained as dispatch riders. They practiced bushwhacking, thundering over steep ridges and through water to master the balance needed to deliver critical messages when all other communications failed. On the back of that Norton, with the Surrey wind stinging his cheeks, Walter found a fleeting, youthful joy, a brief escape from the looming shadow of the front lines. By March 1944, the English waiting room was nearing its end. Stationed at Forest Row, Sussex, Walter was now part of the North Shore, New Brunswick Regiment, preparing for an invasion that felt both inevitable and impossible. It was here that he stood for a photograph alongside Albert Munn, a fellow soldier from Nova Scotia. The 2 men stand before a military ambulance, their uniforms worn and their expressions steeled by years of training. For Walter, Albert wasn't just a comrade, he was a piece of the Maritimes in a foreign land. As they stood on the soft grass of Sussex, the beautiful country he had marveled at from the Irish Sea now served as the final stage for the greatest trial of their lives. The quiet streets of St. John felt a world away, but in his pocket, the leather-bound diary, now filled with names, wildlife, and the tally of Dot's tea, remained his most vital piece of equipment. 3. The Face of Liberation and the Engine of Mercy, September 1944 to January 1945. The English waiting room finally fell away, replaced by the thundering, exhaust-choked reality of the continent. But before Walter ever set foot on a landing craft, he had earned his right to lead the way. In the final months of training in England, he had been granted his provisional license, a simple slip of paper that carried the weight of 1,000 lives. It was the bridge between the young man who rode motorcycles for joy at Gatton Manor and the soldier who would steer through the fires of hell. In September 1944, attached to the Polish army, Walter pushed his ambulance across the border into Belgium. The transition was jarring, from the disciplined drills of Sussex to a world erupting in a chaotic, beautiful joy. On September 3rd, he drove into St. Nicola and Steichen, and for a moment, the weight of the war was lifted by the roar of 1,000 voices. To the people of Belgium, Walter J. McGoldrick, with his striking red hair and steady blue eyes, was more than a driver. He was the living, breathing face of liberation. They pressed flowers against the glass of the ambulance he had learned to master during those long English rainstorms, seeing in him the end of their long nightmare, the shadow of the Siegfried Line. But the joy of Belgium was a brief sunbeam before a gathering storm. By November, Walter was stationed just 7 kilometers from the Siegfried Line, the fortified concrete heart of the German border. The beautiful country was now a landscape he had to navigate with surgical precision, often under the dashboard's dim light to avoid being spotted. The danger was no longer a distant threat. It was a constant, breathing presence. On the night of November 23rd, the world dissolved into fire. The earth was torn apart, as they were shelled all night. In the terrifying chaos, a shell struck with such ferocity that the concussion knocked Walter off his feet. The blast, a physical wall of force, sent him to the ground, leaving him battered and shaken. He spent the following week in a quiet haze of recovery, recording on November 29th that he ate dinner in hospital. The 5-minute miracle, Walter returned to the front just as winter began to take its icy grip, but his brush with death wasn't over. On December 4th, he experienced what he would forever remember as a quote, 5-minute miracle. While parked near the lines, Walter felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to move his ambulance. It wasn't a command or a tactical necessity. It was an instinct, a whisper of intuition from a man who had become finely tuned to the rhythms of the battlefield. He climbed into the cab and pulled the heavy vehicle away. Moments later, the air screamed as a German 88mm shell slammed into the exact patch of earth where he had been parked. By January 15, 1945, his journey was punctuated by the arrival of his official War Department driving permit. Standing at 5 feet 7 inches and a lean 142 pounds, he had proven he had the wiry strength to manhandle heavy machines of mercy through the ruins of Europe. In his diary, where he had once carefully counted Dot's tea bags, Walter now recorded the brutal truth of the Dutch front in 2 chilling, stark words: terrible fighting. As the war ground on, Walter's ambulance remained a sanctuary of mercy. The keeper of the McGoldrick legacy had survived the shadow of the Siegfried Line, but his greatest task, the protection of the Nijmegen Bridge, still lay ahead. IV. The Guardian of the Nijmegen Bridge, December 1944. As Christmas approached, the festive warmth of St. John felt like a fading dream, replaced by a sky over Nijmegen that bloomed with a terrifying new fruit: enemy parachutes. The beautiful country was now a kill zone. On Friday, December 22nd, the order Walter had prepared for since his days in the Fredericton squares finally arrived. German paratroopers were dropping into the darkness with a singular, desperate mission: try to destroy the bridge. In that moment, the line between ambulance driver and frontline soldier evaporated. Walter traded his steering wheel for his rifle, taking his place in the iron shadows of the bridge. The German radio crackled with a chilling boast that echoed through the cold Dutch air: "We will have Nijmegen back by tomorrow." But they hadn't accounted for the quiet courage of men like Walter. That night, he took up his position for a harrowing night of shooting both ways. In the chaos of muzzle flashes and shadows, the man who had once marveled at the electric fish in the Atlantic was now focused on the lethal geometry of urban defense. By the dawn of Saturday, December 23rd, the bridge still stood, a defiant silhouette against the winter sky. Walter reached for his mother's diary, his hands perhaps still steady from the adrenaline, and recorded the grim victory in a single, stark sentence. 7 German paratroopers were shot at bridge. The bridge held, but the sky remained a source of terror. On Boxing Day, as the world back home was gathered around hearths and Christmas trees, a silent V-2 rocket, the vengeance weapon, screamed out of the atmosphere and struck just 50 yards from where Walter stood. The explosion was a final, desperate exclamation point to a week of fire. Walter had arrived in Europe as a keeper of a family legacy. He would leave it as the guardian of the Nijmegen Bridge. The 10 p.m. goodbye to Dot on Winslow Street had been over 2 years ago, but every shot fired and every shell dodged was a step closer to making sure that goodbye wasn't forever. V. The Rhineland Fire, a day of legendary devotion, February 1945. By February 1945, the war had moved into the jagged, bleeding heart of the Rhineland. The atmosphere had curdled into something Walter could only describe as reminding him of Khan. The earth didn't just tremble. The buildings shook continually under the weight of a relentless barrage that felt like the world was tearing at its seams. On Friday, February 23rd, exactly 29 months to the day since he had first boarded the SS Pasteur in Halifax, Walter faced his greatest trial. The whole fleet was called out into a landscape that had dissolved into a sea of luxurious mud. For a man who took pride in order, the filth of the battlefield was a visceral enemy. Yet he pushed his heavy machine through the muck with a steeled, quiet desperation. That single Friday became a day of legendary devotion. While the air screamed with the whistle of incoming mortar fire and the world dissolved into smoke, Walter refused to blink. He pushed his ambulance through the iron storm again and again, making 12 high-speed trips into the mouth of the fire. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, he had single-handedly evacuated 44 casualties, 32 stretcher cases clinging to life, and 12 walking wounded who looked to him as their only hope. The cost of that day was written in blood and fire. The danger was absolute, and the proximity of death was no longer a calculation. It was a reality. Walter's fellow driver, Private Parson, was killed that afternoon when an 88mm shell struck his vehicle with merciless precision. By the time the smoke began to clear that evening, the toll on the unit was staggering. They had started the day as a fleet, but by the end, they were down to only 7 ambulances left standing. Through the suffocating loss and the blinding smoke of the Rhineland, Walter's ambulance remained a miracle of resolve. Even as he moved 44 broken bodies through the fire, his vehicle remained clean and tidy, a small, gleaming island of order in a world that had fallen completely apart. The lonesome boy from St. John had become a titan of mercy, carrying the weight of 44 lives on his back through the luxurious mud of a dying war. VI. The Liberation of Zutphen and the Clean Slate, April 1945 to May 1945. By April 3rd, the war took a turn into the heart of human suffering. Moving deeper into Holland, Walter found a people who were starving, their conditions terrible. Yet, their joy at seeing the Canadians was overwhelming, a desperate, tearful gratitude. In the midst of this crisis, the soldier in Walter remained steeled. That day he personally took 3 German prisoners, securing the very men who had overseen such terrible conditions. The fight for Zutphen on April 8th was fierce. Even after the town was taken, German snipers remained hidden in the jagged shadows of the church steeples, raining fire down on the liberators until 6 o'clock that evening. Walter navigated those sniper-shadowed streets, a witness to the final, desperate gasps of a dying regime. On April 14th, the pace shifted from a crawl to a sprint. Walter began a, quote, 100-mile dash across Holland toward the North Sea, witnessing the final collapse of the enemy's strength as the pocket was sealed. Behind the wheel of his ambulance, Walter felt the frantic pulse of the war's end. He reached for his diary to record the breathless momentum of the advance, noting with a mix of exhaustion and awe that the infantry moving awful fast, hard to keep up. The beautiful country was finally being reclaimed, mile by thundering mile, as the Canadians raced to close the door on the Reich. The end didn't come with a grand fanfare, but with a quiet domestic miracle. On May 9, 1945, the first day of peace, Walter and his mate, Private Vance, found themselves in Leer, Germany. Amidst the ruins of a bombed-out house, they discovered something more precious than any metal: a working washing machine. They didn't have a parade. Walter and Vance celebrated the victory by doing laundry. As the water swirled, washing away the luxurious mud of the Rhineland and the salt of the Atlantic, it was a simple, human act that signaled the long, bloody road had finally come to an end. The keeper of the McGoldrick legacy was ready to trade his uniform for the life waiting for him at 149 Winslow Street. 7. The Long Road to Winslow Street, October 1945 to 1960s. The thunder of the Rhineland and the sniper-shadowed steeples of Zutphen finally faded into the heavy, surreal silence of late 1945. For Walter, the end of the war was a slow, rhythmic realization that the Dutch mud and the English waiting room were finally in his rearview mirror. The mission that had begun with a leather-bound diary and a 10 p.m. goodbye was nearing its final, joyful entry. In October 1945, the steam-choked air of the St. John train station felt sharper and sweeter than any air he had breathed in Europe. As the locomotive hissed to a halt, Walter stepped onto the platform, no longer just a soldier but a survivor who had carried 44 men through the fire. Waiting there in the autumn chill was the constellation that had guided him home: his mother, whose birthday gift had held his history, his brother David, and Dot, the girl from 149 Winslow Street who had seen him last on a Tuesday night 3 years before. To a young David, the sight was unforgettable. His brother returning from the world's greatest stage, still clad in that heavy, salt-aired military coat, a garment that carried the dust of Belgium and the mist of the Irish Sea. The 1,180 days of longing were over. The keeper of the McGoldrick legacy was finally home. Walter transitioned from the chaos of the front lines to a life of quiet, steady industry. He spent the next 40 years as a master machinist for T.S. Sims, bringing the same unwavering precision to his civilian craft that he once used to clear stoppages in his Browning gun. Yet, the uniform remained a part of him. Walter continued his service as a reservist in the militia with the 3 NB Medium Anti-Aircraft Regiment, RCAM. His post-war devotion reached a global stage in 1953, when he was handpicked for the Honor Guard at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Standing tall in London, he represented New Brunswick with the same quiet dignity he had shown at the Nijmegen Bridge. Years later, in the 1960s, he stood at the City Road Armory to receive the Canadian Forces decoration for 12 years of efficient service, a moment captured in the Evening Times Globe that served as a final public salute to his character. Walter J. McGoldrick was more than a name in a diary. He was the man who survived shell blasts, found wonder in the breach of an Atlantic whale, and chose a lifetime of service. He left behind a story etched in ink, grease, and an enduring love for the family that always brought him home.